Hey, what's up guys? Jason here for Soulfire, and today I am bringing you a book review. I'm gonna review a book called Shameless, a Sexual Reformation by Nadia Boltz-Weber. And the purpose here at Soulfire is to provide resources for the church, resources for parents, or resources for yourself along your journey toward sexual integrity. As a result of that, occasionally I will do book reviews for you. I want you to know what books can be helpful and maybe what books you want to watch out for. So one of the questions here we're gonna answer is, should you buy and read this book? And I'm gonna break down some of the arguments that we have here. I'll tell you what I agree with, maybe some stuff that I don't agree with, but I wanna challenge you, stay tuned toward the end, because at the end, I'm gonna propose the one question you've gotta answer for you to determine whether you are on board with this book calling for a sexual reformation. All right, so let's start with who is our author, Nadia Boltz-Weber. I was not familiar with her work, but this book was actually recommended to me from a friend who had some folks in his church that were reading it, and he asked me for my take on the arguments here in this book. So this comes straight from the inside cover. She is a former stand-up comic, recovering alcoholic, and she founded a Lutheran church called House for All Sinners and Saints in Denver, and currently she's been writing and speaking to large audiences. She's had very good success as an author. This is actually her third book to hit the New York Times bestseller. So let's jump in and take a look at some of these arguments that she has here in her book. Okay, so what's the premise of the book here? Ultimately, the premise of her book is that she wants you to be true to yourself, to be free to express your sexuality however you desire. She wants you to throw off any shackles or chains that have hindered your sexual expression. And so be true to yourself, be free to be yourself. And so a direct quote here from the book, she says, whatever sexual flourishing looks like for you, that's what I would love to see happen in your life. And ultimately, the only boundaries that she would place on sexual expression is anything involving minors, animals, or anything that would ultimately hurt those that you love. And so really, she's got a wide open door for how you express sexuality. So where does our author get the authority to make these claims? Well, she makes it very clear that her authority comes from her life experience, her opinion, but ultimately it's from the interviews that she's had with those in her church. All right, let's tackle issue number one. Why is our author claiming that we need a sexual reformation in the church? And so first she would say that people have been hurt by the evangelical Christian purity movement. The purity movement primarily in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. And you could summarize the purity movement by saying that the purity movement was your sexuality is limited to sex within marriage, single people should not be sexual, and then as a Christian, keeping yourself pure is one of the highest goals that you can have. And if you keep yourself sexually pure, God will bless you with an amazing marriage, with a phenomenal sex life. That's essentially the purity movement. If you haven't kept yourself pure, well, you know, God still loves you and he's got some sort of plan B, but you've probably ruined your sexual life. I mean, those are some of the general themes that came out of the evangelical purity movement. This is one of the reasons that I believe this book has resonated with so many, because this is true. I totally agree with her that the evangelical purity movement preached toxic legalism, and it really preached you've got to remain pure, then God will bless you, is essentially the prosperity gospel of sex. And this was extremely painful, because when people stepped out of God's design for sexuality from the scriptures, they were guilted, they were shamed, and you know, they would think that they're impure, that they've really ruined themselves. So there was a lot of toxic messaging coming out of that. She references Joshua Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which was probably the main mover for the evangelical purity movement. And she also references in her book in a footnote that, you know, Joshua Harris has since walked back a lot of those claims because he too has realized how he hurt people. So her first premise that the evangelical purity movement has hurt people, I totally agree with her. So issue number two for why our author Nadia Boltz-Weber says we need a sexual reformation in the church is that she says the church has often played the hypocrite and been like the Pharisees in terms of those who struggle with sexual sin. So she references John chapter 8, Jesus is presented with a woman caught in adultery, and the Pharisees say, hey, you know, this woman according to the law should be stoned. What do you say? And so she says the church has so often been like those Pharisees where we've divided people into pure and impure. This again goes back to that evangelical purity movement. And we've wanted to throw stones at those who don't fully follow God's design for sexuality. And so ultimately, Jesus does not throw stones at this woman. He's merciful to her. And he says, let those who are without sin be the first to throw stones. And so here, again, I would have to totally agree with her that the church has often been more like Pharisees than like Jesus, and we have wanted to throw stones, and this has caused people to be hurt and to be ostracized and to be pushed out from the church. And she shares her own personal story of how in the church that she grew up in, women were only valued based on their looks and what they could do for their husbands. And so as you read her story, and if this description of the church she grew up in is accurate, I would fully agree with her that it was a very toxic environment where women were really mistreated. They were not given the love and respect that I believe the scriptures call us in the church to love and respect women with. And so she came out of this very toxic environment. And so for those reasons, she's calling for a sexual reformation. Now, because of the nature of this channel and a lot of the subject matter that we typically cover, I wanted to include in this book review the author's take on pornography. And so she rightly sees how many people have turned to the easy access of pornography to numb the pain in their life. And she concludes, how could somebody be satisfied with their middle-aged spouse if they're filling their eyes, filling their mind with these computer-enhanced, surgically enhanced, perfect sexual experiences that you see through pornography? So she rightly concludes that that certainly is going to have an impact on your sexuality in marriage. But given the nature of the premise of her book, how she wants you to be free sexually, she stops short of saying, pornography is not something that we in the church should be falling into. And she really leaves it to the couple. She says, hey, a lot of people I've talked to believe that pornography has enhanced their relationships. And so she basically says about pornography, let the couple decide. If this is something you want to use, if this is something that's helpful to you, go ahead and go for it. Now, given the premise of her book, she's staying consistent in that matter. So what is her conclusion from her book here? Where she says people have been hurt by the church, the evangelical purity movement. The church has divided people into pure and impure. As a result of that, she says we should throw off all rules and boundaries and people should be free to express themselves sexually however they want. Now, this is where I'm going to have to disagree. I agree with some of her premise for how she's gotten here, but to say we just throw all rules out the window, I don't actually believe that's where people are going to find life. So that brings me to the one question that you have got to answer if you're going to decide that you will side with the arguments here in this book or not. That one question is, who determines what is right or wrong? Is it man or is it God? Because if you believe that it's people who determine right or wrong, then you will agree with the arguments here in this book. Because ultimately she says her authority is coming from what she believes and also from the interviews she's had with people in her church. And granted, you hear the stories that she's written about folks in her church. They've been through many difficulties and they've experienced a lot of persecution, maybe from some toxic legalistic settings that they were in. So they've gone through a lot of pain, but do we then take that situation and say, well, we'll come together, we will determine what is right or wrong. We will decide what are the rules and boundaries of sexuality. If you go that route, especially in a religious context, you're really forced to throw out the Bible. You cannot blend those two ideas of we as people will determine what is right or wrong and biblical Christianity. They're not compatible. And so there's a story here in her book where one of her parishioners was very offended by the message of the scriptures. And this person began to rip out books of the Bible until she was left with only the Gospels. And here in the book, Nadia Boltz-Weber applauds that these books of the Bible were offensive to her, so she ripped them out so she wouldn't have to be offended by their message. Because at no point is the Bible going to tell us that we are to be true to ourselves, we are to look inward and live out our desires. In fact, that's the exact opposite of the Bible. You cannot blend the idea of living my heart, following my heart, being true to myself, and biblical Christianity. Let me just give you a few samples of scripture where you'll see quickly that idea is rejected. Colossians 3:5 tells us we are to put to death what is earthly in us. Galatians 5:24, those who belong to Jesus Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. 1 Peter 2:11, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against your soul. Romans 8:29, where our goal is to become more like Christ, not like ourselves. Proverbs 14:12, there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end is the ways of death. Romans 8:13, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Galatians 5:13, you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity to the flesh, but through love serve one another. Now, those were from the epistles, right? Those are some of the passages that Nadia Boltz-Weber is really advocating we don't have to follow. And so this parishioner was ripping those books out. She was left with only the Gospels. So if you study the Gospels, there in the Gospels, will you find Jesus telling you to be true to yourself, to live however you want, that you can determine what is right or wrong? You will not. In Luke 9:23, the message of Jesus was, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Biblical Christianity is not compatible with the cultural notion of staying true to yourself, living out your heart. In fact, it's the opposite. It's telling us to put to death those desires that we have in our heart, to reject all of those, to not follow what we desire, but to ultimately submit those to God and what He desires. But as I conclude this book review, there's one issue I want to address that the book talks about, and it talks about the idea that the church has very often divided people into two camps, the pure and the impure. And I think the evangelical purity movement really did that. It pushed this message that if you do these certain things God's way, then you're pure, and you got to guard your purity. And if you don't, then you're impure. And it used guilt and shame to kind of push people down. I actually don't believe that's what the Bible teaches. I don't believe that the Bible teaches there are two groups of people. And so here's a quote from the book. She says, if you were to draw a circle that represents all the people on the planet, and then inside it draw another circle to represent the people who live according to God's plan, then, well, very few people on the planet would fit into that circle. And what I would actually say is, what I believe the gospel teaches is that none of us are in that circle of living according to God's plan. The message of the scripture is that there is none righteous. None of us can say we are pure. We are all broken. We are all sexually broken. That's why Jesus had to come. None of us can say to God that we've lived your plan, we've done it perfectly, we by our hands have earned righteousness, and we can be with you. The message of the gospel is that we are all broken, and that's why we desperately need Jesus. And so I believe the church needs to get behind that. We can't divide people into pure and impure. We can't say to one group of people that you are sexual sinners. And so in that story that she references in John chapter 8, the reason that the religious leaders shouldn't throw stones at the woman caught in adultery is that they too deserved to be stoned. Jesus said, let the one who's without sin be the first to throw a stone. But remember the words that Jesus left her with. He said, I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more. He offered her that gift of non-condemnation. The punishment she deserved, that we all deserved, Jesus would take. He would pay for her sins and my sins on the cross. That's the beauty of the gospel. None of us are pure. All of us are impure and desperate and needy for Jesus. Now, I want to recommend a few resources for you. Unfortunately, this book, Unashamed, is not a resource that I can recommend, but two books that I would recommend that talk about many of the same subject matter. First, there's a book called Rethinking, Sexuality by Dr. Juli Slattery. She addresses a lot of these issues in the evangelical purity movement, and she comes to different conclusions. And a second resource I want to recommend is a book called Guiding Families. It's a book to help families in the church love people in the LGBT community, because the church really needs to address how we have kind of divided people into those two camps of pure and impure. And the ministry Lead Them Home is a fantastic resource where they can help churches to love those that have so often been marginalized and ostracized. And so one thing that I can applaud Nadia Boltz-Weber for, as you read her book, is that she has a heart to help people. And that is a beautiful thing. And I think the resource that Lead Them Home can help you do that as well. Well, thanks so much for watching. If you like this review, be sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll have some more resources coming up to you. Thanks so much. Have a great one.